So yesterday in here, we focused our lesson around the commonalities that we see between the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire. These three empires that really kind of reached their peak of size and prosperity during the early part of the 1500s, the same time period that pretty much dovetails with the beginning of the Protestant Reformation over in Europe. Now, instead of getting into all the nitty-gritty details, we tried to focus our lesson yesterday on what were these commonalities. You know, what was this winning formula that made these empires great? And I highlighted stuff like, you know, their willingness to promote art and innovation and valuing learning. We talked about how all three of these societies, at least during the good times, were societies that very much valued inclusivity, whether it be different ethnic groups or people of different religions. They gave them a voice, they made them feel valued as part of the empire. We highlighted things like, you know, their advancements, especially in gunpowder weaponry, and how both the Ottomans and the Safavids were some of the first countries on earth to really understand the way that the winds of military change were blowing, specifically by creating some of the world's first true professional standing armies. Well, today we're going to pretty much piggyback off of yesterday's lesson by continuing to look at commonalities, but we're going to focus more on the commonalities that brought about decline. Now, none of these empires go out in kind of a blaze of glory. When I say decline, all three of these states take a very long time to weaken and eventually crumble. But one could argue that really it's a lot of the decisions made in the 15 and 1600s that put them on this path to kind of struggle and decay. As we did yesterday, we're going to pretty much look at the story of the Ottomans as kind of this prototypical example of all three. The Ottomans, you could argue, reached the peak of their prosperity. They're the best that they've ever been during the reign of the man that you see pictured here, Suleyman I, aka Suleyman the Magnificent, aka Suleyman the Lawgiver. Suleyman, during his tenure, was probably the most powerful political leader on earth. People knew his name for thousands of miles in all directions. Yet I would argue that in addition to being amongst the greatest of the Ottoman sultans, and greatest leaders maybe that the Muslim world had ever known, that it was also Suleyman that sent his empire on this road towards second-class status. So to help us understand why that is, what Suleyman was basically responsible for, I've invited in today a lovely guest speaker to talk to all of you, an expert on the subject. And because of all the COVID restrictions and protocols, of course I could not invite him in while there were students in the school and in the classroom. So hence why I arranged this for him to come after school hours and why I'm recording this. But my hope is that you'll hear what he says and really understand and appreciate the two-sided nature of Suleyman's legacy. So let me go ahead and get him, and I'll bring him in here in a second. Introducing Sultan Selim II, Caliph of the Muslim world, son of Muhammad, brother of the sun and the moon, grandson and viceroy of God, ruler of the kingdoms of Macedonia, Babylon, Jerusalem, Upper and Lower Egypt, emperor of emperors, sovereign of sovereigns, extraordinary knight, never defeated on the battlefield, steadfast guardian of the tomb of Jesus, trustee chosen by God himself, the hope and comfort of Muslims, and the confounder and great defeater of his enemies. Well, this is not as elaborate of a throne and throne room as I am used to, but it will have to work. So yes, peons, it is I, Selim II, Sultan of the Ottomans, and your instructor has beckoned me today forth from my palace to speak to you about my father, Suleyman. Suleyman the Great, Suleyman the Lawgiver. All anyone ever wants to do is talk about Suleyman. No one ever wants to talk about me. For you see, my father was known as the greatest of all Ottoman sultans. He was known to be wise, judicious, someone who reformed our legal system, lowered taxes on the common man, lessened regulation, promoted the arts. He was universally revered by all subjects. And at the same time that he did great deeds at home to earn him domestic praise, so too did he win battles on the battlefield and expand our empire in all directions. It was truly a golden age of prosperity for our people. But you see, despite all of the great things that my father has done, he is also the source of many of the ills that currently plague me and my empire. For you see, my father, like many great leaders before him, could not stop. He did not know where to draw that line in the sand in terms of his wars and expansion. And in his mind, he felt that Europe literally lay before his feet. That in Central Europe, the Catholics and the Protestants were so busy fighting amongst themselves that he could capitalize and strike at the heart of Christendom. So in 1529, against the advice of many of his top military commanders, my father launched an invasion into the state of Austria with the hopes of capturing the Habsburg capital of Vienna. Now, what my father did not count on was that fall was an unusually cool one. And throughout much of September and early October, the region saw torrential rains. Rains that turned the roads to mud and forced us to leave much of our valuable cannon lying by the roadside. When we arrived, therefore, before the gates and walls of Vienna, we were but an impotent army. We could encircle them. We could attempt to starve them out, but we could not batter down the walls of that great fortress city the same way that we had done with Belgrade or Mohacs or so many other cities that we had taken previously. And so we dug in and hunkered down for a protracted siege. Well, then by mid-October, the snows came. And I remember being a young lad with my father, perusing the battlefield and seeing men frozen solid to death as they had slept. That literally we had to pour boiling water on top of the dead bodies to thaw them enough to remove them and give them a proper burial. So after about 2 weeks of such conditions, we realized that our efforts at that point had been for naught, and we withdrew. Never again will our people go so far. For you see, by gambling all of our national resources into this one massive thrust and losing, we had blunted our ability to respond elsewhere. And we always have the Safavids nipping at our heels. We have Christian pirates and Italians over on the Mediterranean. Heck, just even last week, my fleet of more than 300 ships was defeated by a united Christian fleet at a place called Lepanto. 30,000, oh, sorry, they must think that I am dead because I have not moved in a while. There we go. 30,000 Ottoman sailors drowned in that one-day battle. With Vienna, we reached the zenith of our military power and domination on the battlefield. The other terrible mistake that my father made, while I personally do not view him as so magnificent, is what brings me before you in the first place. For you see, I am somebody, to be honest with you, who should never, ever have been given the reins of power. I grew up in the palace, and like many of my father's children, because my father had over 500 wives and concubines, I spent much of my time running around the harem in an environment of women and children. It had been custom and tradition since time immemorable amongst us descendants of Osman that the best and brightest should take the mantle of power, that the most competent, that the most able should be the one that should be the next sultan. And as the best and the brightest took the lead, our empire continued to grow and prosper. It was a winning formula. Well, a big part of this winning formula was a type of savagery that played out in the harem for the children of the sultan. Well, we would be encouraged by our mothers and the servants to get rid of our competition, to assassinate potential rivals amongst our siblings or half-siblings, so that we would be the one that would stand by ourselves at the end to inherit the throne. You had to be brave, you had to be bright, you had to be cunning, you had to be devious, you had to be a great warrior, you had to be able to think on your feet. I have never been any of these. I am not very smart. I am not overly ambitious. I am definitely not strong. I mean, look at me. I'm pathetic. My clothes are ragged and barely even fit. I am probably the last choice for who should have ever became sultan. Even today, my own subjects, derisively refer to me not by my proper dignified name, Sultan Selim II, but rather they call me Selim the Drunkard, or Selim the Blonde, making fun of the fact that they think I am some girly man. Well, if you're wondering how did somebody like me manage then to survive this Hunger Games scenario and ascend the throne, well, the answer is my mother. My mother was the beautiful Serbian peasant girl, Roxolana. Yes, I know, it sounds like a stripper name or something, but that's a name. And Roxolana was Suleyman's most favorite wife. She captivated him. My father, at the peak of his power, was the most powerful man on earth. Yet there was one person that controlled Suleyman, that he would do anything for to please. And that was Roxolana. do you still use today the term to describe in a relationship that a man is, and I quote, whipped? That was my father. If my mother said, "Hey, Suleyman, jump," he would ask how high. After my father's death, I was rummaging through some of his things, looking for guidance, and I stumbled across some poetry that he had written. He always was such the learned scholar and professor of the arts. And he used to like to write poetry for my mother. So here's a poem that I found, written to her. Throne of my lonely niche, my wealth, my love, my moonlight, my most sincere friend, my confidant, my very existence, my sultan, my one and only love, the most beautiful amongst the beautiful, my springtime, my merry-faced love, my daytime, my sweetheart, laughing leaf, my plants, my sweet, my rose, the one and only who does not distress me in this world, my Constantinople, my Karaman, the earth of my Anatolia, my Bakhtistan, my Baghdad and Khorasan, my woman of the beautiful hair, my love of the slanted brow, my love of eyes full of mischief, I sing your praises always. I, lover of the tormented leaf, Muhabi of the eyes of tears, I am happy, and you make me so. Again, what is with the lighting in this palace? Jeez, man. Gotta get some good servants around here. Isn't that disgusting? Yet that shows how head over heels in love my father was for my mother. He would do anything for her. And there was one thing that my mother loved amongst all else that made her happy. Me, her son. And my mother knew that I would never survive in the palace. She knew that I would not rise on my own accord to the position of the sultan, that it was only a matter of time till I would be eliminated. And she could not bear this. So at night she would whisper in my father's ears, Suleyman, honey baby, choose my son Selim as your successor. Give him the reins of power. It will make me so happy. And so my father took time-honored tradition and threw it away the same that I just threw away his poem. I watched one by one as more able, competent brethren of mine were eliminated at Suleyman's orders. In fact, in one instance, I vividly remember watching through a keyhole with my father as we looked into an adjoining courtyard and watched my brother Mustafa be strangled to death by a palace eunuch. Suleyman eliminated all opposition to me to allow me to survive and be king. Now you might say, why, Selim, why so distraught by this? You live a life of creature comfort. Yes, this is true. My mother and Suleyman have given me a great gift. But I fear where this gift will take us. Because again, I've seen in my own life the decline of my state. And I look at my own children and I know that they are not of the lineage that will restore us Ottomans to our position of dominance in the world. So, I've vented too long. This has become a remote therapy session for me, but I must say, I
I appreciate you listening. And I must get on my way to deal with the job I must do. Thank you.
Wow, there you have it. I mean, you guys are so lucky. The fact that you got to have come into your classroom a guest speaker of that level of fame and expertise. I mean, really something truly special. Now, my hope is, in addition to just enjoying listening to His Sultan, His Highness, that you also kind of understood how Suleyman's actions were inherently disruptive to future generations of Ottoman leaders and Ottoman peoples. That basically the Ottomans serve as this kind of example of the general reasons for decline that we see play out in all three of these states from the 15 through the 1600s. That first and foremost, and what Suleyman's example highlights, is this move away from a merit-based system of leadership. I mentioned yesterday that in all three states you had this history of really competent young leaders. And why were those super young leaders able to kind of emerge and lead? Because it wasn't based off of necessarily who was the firstborn. It wasn't necessarily based off of age and experience. It was based off of what you could do. And if you were good on the battlefield, if you were intelligent, if you were charismatic, people followed you. And as a result, these empires thrust up good leader after good leader after good leader for generations. It's when the Ottomans moved specifically toward a hand-picked successor model, that it's not the best, but it's rather the favorite or the firstborn son, that things then start to go down a path that they can't get back off from. The Safavids do the same thing. You read about Shah Abbas. Shah Abbas is the greatest of the Safavid Shahs or kings. Leads them through their golden age. And yet Shah Abbas does the exact same thing that Suleyman does. He picks a favorite son. That favorite son is not competent and able to handle the reins of power. He replicates the same thing moving forward. The Safavids are never as prosperous and able as they once were. Second point, the lack of inclusivity, or how that ends up waning. Now, we don't see that in the short term with the Ottomans, but we do see it in the long term with the Ottomans, and we see it in the long term with all three. I mean, you saw how with the Safavids, that the Safavids start off with these religious zealots, right? Convert or die. But then they enter into their period of utmost prosperity when they try to open up to the outside world, where they encourage foreign trade, where they encourage people like Europeans to move into their empire and bring their expertise and skills. They're valued for their differences. Well, later on in the empire, the Safavids kind of circle back to that old, religious zealotry, our way or the highway, and we see then those people that were different leave, that prosperity vanish. In places like the Mughal Empire, you got Aurangzeb. Okay, you saw that little video that highlighted Aurangzeb a lot, this guy with a really long name. Aurangzeb, great battlefield commander, but he pretty much reneges on the policies of toleration toward Hindus that had been a hallmark of Mughal rule and prosperity. He alienates the Hindus, which are the vast majority of the population, and then he wonders why there's all these revolts breaking out all the time, all these wars that he has to fight. It's the beginning of the end for the Mughal Empire. With the Ottomans, this rolling back of inclusivity doesn't really happen until the cusp of modernity, early 1800s, when the Ottomans decide that it's time once and for all to disband the Devshirme system. That whole system that used to create the Janissaries. They get rid of the Janissaries. And what ends up happening is, instead of differing peoples being happy to be part of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. Instead, people start identifying with kind of a new identity, Arab identity, Armenian identity, Kurdish identity. And so what we see entering into the 20th century is major internal rebellion and kind of fissures forming between the ethnic groups in that empire as well. Third point highlighted by our lovely guest speaker, the overstretching of these empires militarily. You know, they expand, they expand, they expand, they're fighting wars, they're fighting wars, they're fighting wars, and they all get to that point where it kind of reaches critical mass, where the benefits, you know, are far less than the costs of expansion. See it in India with Aurangzeb again. He expands the empire to its largest size. Okay, it looks big on the map, it looks impressive. But at the same point, if he's way over here at one end of the empire, how are you supposed to necessarily effectively govern another? It's the cost of that expansion that results in higher tax rates, results in periods of famine, results in unrest. Expansion not necessarily equaling prosperity. You know, with the Ottomans and the Safavids, part of their problem, I mean, the Ottomans, yeah, you headed into Europe and the siege of Vienna, but you also had the fact that they were fighting each other for hundreds of years. This kind of constant slugfest, dab smack in the middle of the Middle East. And if you look where they were fighting over, where their boundary was, it runs right through modern day Iraq. You know, why is Iraq a country that has so many modern day issues, so much issues with sectarian violence and lack of national unity? You know, why do they have a large Shiite population and a large Sunni population? This is why. And it drained both of them. And then finally, you know, my last point is that, hey, it's not like the Europeans are napping here. You know, as these states all kind of enter into this, you know, they reach their peak and they start down the other side of the mountain, is at the same time that, again, the Europeans are really hitting their stride. They're really making gains. They're really innovating. They're really progressing as whole societies. And in terms of the military part, Islamic empires had this military superiority originally. Well, then you get stuff like the Protestant Reformation. Then you get stuff like 150 years of non-stop religious warfare in Europe between Protestants and Catholics. And what happens is that, you know, the Europeans figure things out from that constant experience. You know, hey, I'm going to get a leg up on the other guy, and I'm going to figure out how to use this gun thing. I'm going to get really good at the mathematics behind using artillery. And before you know it, all of a sudden, the Europeans are bringing the bigger guns to bear. It happens that fast. So again, when I talk about decline, I don't want you to think that this is instantaneous, because it's not. You know, I listed on the board here kind of a rough approximation of what is generally considered the start of this decline versus the end implosion of the empire, where that state simply ceases to exist. You know, it's like with the Ottomans. Ottomans founded in the late 1200s, reached their peak in the 1500s. Doesn't disappear until after World War I, 1923. That is a really long, protracted decline. Safavid Empire reaches their peak 1629, implodes by the early 1700s. Mughals, decline starts early 1600s, ends 1857. So big picture, what we see is that, you know, these states still exist. These states still hold clout. These states still have large armies. These states still, you know, have decent-sized economies where they're capable of holding the Europeans at bay. You know, the Europeans are not going to be able to waltz on into Persia. They're not going to be able to waltz on into the Middle East. But at the same time, while they're able to hold these interlopers at bay, this is part of the explanation about why it's not these states that are going out and doing the exploring themselves. Why it's a European-centric world and maybe not a Middle Eastern-centric, Indian-centric, more Persian-centric world that we're currently living in.